God's protection is not just a comforting thought, it is a divine promise woven throughout Scripture. From Genesis to Revelation, we see the evidence of God's unwavering commitment to guarding His children. He does not offer a weak or uncertain defense. His protection is firm, steadfast, and immovable. When God makes a promise, He keeps it. His word is eternal, and His faithfulness endures from generation to generation. He does not fail, and He does not abandon those who put their trust in Him. The Bible is filled with examples of God shielding His people. Consider Noah, who lived in a corrupt world yet found favor with God. When destruction came upon the earth, God provided a way of escape, sealing Noah and his family inside the ark. It was not the strength of the ark alone that saved them but God's divine hand protecting them through the storm. Then there is Daniel, thrown into the lion's den for his unwavering faith, yet not a single lion could harm him. Why? Because God shut the mouths of the lions. His promise of protection was not dependent on Daniel's strength but on God's power. Psalm 9:1 is one of the most powerful declarations of God's protection. It speaks of dwelling in the secret place of the Most High, abiding under the shadow of the Almighty. It assures that those who trust in the Lord will be delivered from deadly traps, from pestilence, and from destruction. 1,000 may fall at one side, 10,000 at the other, but it will not come near those under God's care. This promise is not just for the past, it is for today, for every believer who puts their faith in Him. God's protection does not mean we will never face difficulties, but it does mean we are never without His covering. Just as He protected the Israelites in the wilderness, leading them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, He leads His people today. His protection is not limited to physical safety but extends to the mind, heart, and spirit. He guards against deception, against fear, against the attacks of the enemy. His protection is holistic, covering every area of life. Many times, people look at their circumstances and wonder if God is truly protecting them. They see trials, hardships, and setbacks, and question His presence. Yet, God's protection is not always about keeping us from trouble, it is about keeping us through it. Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers, falsely accused, and thrown into prison, yet God's hand was on him the entire time. What seemed like abandonment was actually divine positioning for a greater purpose. Paul faced shipwrecks, beatings, and persecution, yet he stood firm, knowing that God's grace and protection were with him. God's protection is also seen in the unseen battles. There are dangers and attacks that we are completely unaware of, yet He is working behind the scenes, keeping us from harm. There are accidents we never encountered, sicknesses we never suffered, and spiritual battles we never had to fight because God intervened before we even knew. His angels are sent to guard His people, to lift them up, to ensure they walk in safety. Believers must walk in faith, trusting in His promises. Fear should not dictate decisions, nor should worry consume the heart. The enemy seeks to instill doubt, to make people believe they are vulnerable, unprotected, and forgotten. But faith in God's protection silences those lies. His word is the foundation, and His faithfulness is the evidence. When trials come, His promise remains. When darkness surrounds, His light still shines. The safest place a person can be is in the center of God's will, under His divine protection. Staying under God's covering is essential for experiencing His divine protection. Throughout Scripture, God extends His hand of safety to those who remain in close relationship with Him. His covering is not automatic, it requires a conscious decision to abide in His presence, to walk in obedience, and to trust His guidance. The Lord provides refuge, but a person must choose to dwell in that place of safety rather than stepping outside of His will. The Israelites experienced this truth firsthand. When they were in Egypt, God delivered them through mighty acts and led them toward the promised land. However, His protection came with instructions. The blood of the lamb had to be applied to the doorposts during the Passover for the destroyer to pass over their homes. Those who obeyed remained safe under God's covering, while those outside of His command faced destruction. This pattern is seen throughout their journey. When they followed God, they walked in victory, but when they strayed, they faced consequences. His protection was always available, but it required their obedience and trust. The same principle applies today. God calls His children to dwell in His presence, to walk according to His word, and to seek Him daily. Psalm 91 speaks of those who dwell in the secret place of the Most High and abide under His shadow. This is not a temporary visit but a continuous, intentional choice to remain close to Him. Dwelling in His presence means prioritizing time with Him, making His voice the loudest in life, and aligning every decision with His will. It means refusing to live in rebellion or compromise, knowing that stepping outside of His will exposes a person to unnecessary battles. Many times, people step out from under God's covering by allowing sin, doubt, or distractions to pull them away. The enemy tempts with shortcuts, offering a path that seems easier but leads to destruction. He whispers lies that make disobedience appear harmless, yet even small compromises can remove a person from the place of divine protection. Adam and Eve walked in perfect safety until they stepped outside of God's instruction. The moment they listened to the serpent and acted on their own understanding, they lost the covering of the garden and had to face the consequences of their choice. Obedience keeps a person under God's protection, not as a burden but as a safeguard. His commands are not restrictions meant to limit joy but are given out of love to lead His children toward life and peace. Just as a shepherd leads his sheep to safety, God provides direction that ensures His people remain under His care. A sheep that stays close to the shepherd is safe from wolves, but one that wanders away becomes vulnerable. God's covering also operates through faith. Trusting in His plan, even when it does not make sense, is a way of staying under His shelter. Many times, people rely on their own wisdom and step into situations outside of God's timing, leading to unnecessary struggles. Abraham and Sarah attempted to fulfill God's promise in their own way, and it resulted in hardship. But when Abraham later walked in full obedience, God's protection and blessing were evident. Prayer is another key to remaining under God's covering. Constant communication with Him builds a strong relationship, allowing His guidance to be clear. Jesus often withdrew to pray, staying connected to the Father. He remained under the Father's will, even in moments of great trial, and walked in complete protection until the appointed time of His sacrifice. When believers make prayer a priority, they remain sensitive to God's voice, avoiding pitfalls that come from making decisions in the flesh. God desires His children to remain under His covering not just for their safety but for their peace and confidence. When a person knows they are walking in obedience and staying. Prayer is a powerful tool that activates divine protection. Throughout Scripture, God makes it clear that He listens to the prayers of His people and responds to their cries for help. Prayer is not just a routine or a religious practice, it is a direct line of communication with the Almighty, the one who holds all power and authority. When believers pray, they are not speaking empty words into the air, they are engaging in a spiritual conversation with the Creator of the universe, inviting His presence, guidance, and protection into their lives. Many times in the Bible, God's protection was activated through prayer. When King Hezekiah was threatened by the Assyrian army, he turned to the Lord in prayer, laying the enemy's threatening letter before God. Instead of panicking or relying on human strength, Hezekiah sought divine intervention. God responded by sending an angel to strike down 185,000 enemy soldiers in one night, delivering His people without them even having to fight. This was not by military strategy or human effort but by the power of God moving in response to prayer. Daniel is another example of someone who relied on prayer for protection. Even when a law was passed forbidding prayer to anyone except the king, Daniel continued his daily habit of praying to God. Because of his faithfulness, he was thrown into a den of hungry lions. Yet, because Daniel had already cultivated a strong prayer life and trusted in God's protection, he remained unharmed. The mouths of the lions were shut, and he emerged without a scratch. His consistent communication with God had already placed him under divine covering before the danger even arrived. Jesus Himself demonstrated the power of prayer in times of trouble. Before facing the cross, He went to the Garden of Gethsemane and poured out His heart to the Father. His prayer did not prevent the trial, but it strengthened Him to endure it. He also prayed for His disciples, asking the Father to protect them from the evil one. This shows that prayer is not only about personal protection but also about interceding for others, covering them with God's grace and shielding them from harm. The early church understood the power of prayer for divine protection. When Peter was imprisoned, the believers gathered and prayed earnestly for his release. In response, an angel of the Lord came, broke his chains, and led him out of the prison unnoticed. Their prayers activated supernatural intervention, proving that when God's people unite in prayer, miracles happen. Prayer is a declaration of dependence on God. It acknowledges that human strength and wisdom are not enough to navigate the challenges of life. When believers pray, they invite God to take control, to fight battles on their behalf, and to provide the covering they need. It is through prayer that divine strategies are revealed, obstacles are removed, and supernatural peace replaces fear. Consistent prayer builds a fortress around a person's life. Just as a soldier does not wait until the battle begins to prepare, a believer should not wait until danger comes to start praying. Daily communication with God strengthens faith, reinforces trust, and ensures that His protection is always near. Prayer creates a shield that the enemy cannot easily penetrate. It places a person under the shadow of the Almighty, where no weapon formed against them can prosper. The enemy understands the power of prayer, which is why he tries to distract, discourage, and create doubt in the hearts of believers. He knows that a prayerful person is a protected person. When individuals neglect prayer, they become more vulnerable to attacks, more prone to fear, and more susceptible to making decisions outside of God's will. But when prayer is a priority, God's presence surrounds them, guiding them away from danger and into His divine security. Faith is the key to overcoming fear and walking in the protection of God. Throughout Scripture, God continually reminds His people not to be afraid but to trust in Him completely. Fear is a natural human response to uncertainty, danger, and the unknown, but faith is a spiritual response that places confidence in God's promises rather than circumstances. Faith is not based on what can be seen or understood. It is rooted in the unshakable truth that God is in control, that He is faithful, and that He will never fail those who trust in Him. One of the greatest examples of faith over fear is seen in the story of David and Goliath. While the entire army of Israel trembled before the giant, David stepped forward in faith. He did not rely on his own strength, nor did he allow fear to dictate his actions. Instead, he declared that the battle belonged to the Lord. His faith in God's power gave him the courage to stand against what seemed like an impossible challenge. He did not wear the armor of man, but he was clothed in the armor of faith, and with one stone, he brought down the giant. Faith activated God's power and protection in his life. The Israelites at the Red Sea faced a moment where they had to choose between fear and faith. With Pharaoh's army behind them and the sea in front of them, fear could have paralyzed them. But Moses declared, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord." When they chose faith over fear, God parted the waters and made a way where there seemed to be none. Had they allowed fear to control them, they might have turned back or given up, but faith led them to victory and safety. Jesus frequently addressed the issue of fear and faith with His disciples. When a storm arose while they were in a boat, fear overtook them. They panicked, thinking they would perish, even though Jesus was right there with them. He rebuked the storm, but He also rebuked their lack of faith. The presence of Jesus should have been enough to calm their fears, yet they allowed the storm to dictate their emotions. Faith is choosing to trust that even when the waves rise, God is still in control. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood before King Nebuchadnezzar with their lives on the line. They were given a choice: bow to an idol or be thrown into a fiery furnace. Fear would have led them to compromise, to rationalize why they should obey the king's command. But their faith was greater than their fear. They declared that God was able to deliver them, but even if He did not, they would not bow. Their unwavering faith led to divine protection as God Himself walked with them in the fire, ensuring that not even a hair on their heads was burned. The enemy uses fear as a weapon to weaken faith and cause doubt. He whispers lies, magnifies problems, and makes situations seem impossible. But faith silences the voice of fear by standing firm on God's promises. When fear says, "What if?" faith responds, "Even if, I will trust God." Faith is not the absence of difficulties, but it is the presence of trust in the midst of them. It does not deny the reality of challenges, but it chooses to focus on the greater reality of God's power and presence. Walking by faith requires a conscious decision to reject fear and believe that God is greater than any obstacle. It means declaring His promises over every situation, refusing to be moved by negative reports, and resting in the assurance that He is working all things for good. Faith aligns the heart with God's truth, making it possible to move forward with confidence, knowing that His protection is always present. God assigns His angels to watch over His people, providing divine protection in ways that are often unseen but always effective. Throughout Scripture, angels are depicted as messengers, warriors, and guardians sent by God to protect, guide, and deliver His children from danger. Their presence is a reminder that believers are never alone, even in the most difficult situations. While human eyes may not always perceive them, angels are actively working behind the scenes, ensuring that God's plans prevail and that His people remain under His covering. One of the clearest demonstrations of angelic protection is found in Psalm 91, which declares that God will give His angels charge over those who trust in Him. This divine assignment is not random or occasional, it is a continuous watchfulness over the lives of believers. Angels are commanded to guard, to lift up, and to prevent harm from coming to those who dwell in the presence of God. Their role is not based on human merit but on God's promise to protect those who walk in obedience and faith. In the story of Daniel, God's angelic protection is evident when he is thrown into the lion's den. The king had no power to save him, and by all natural reasoning, Daniel should have perished. Yet, because he remained faithful to God, an angel was sent to shut the mouths of the lions. This was not just a coincidence or an act of nature, it was divine intervention. Daniel's trust in God placed him under supernatural protection, proving that no earthly decree or enemy's plot can override God's ability to save. When Peter was imprisoned, the church prayed earnestly for his release. In response, God sent an angel to lead him out of the prison. The chains fell off his hands, the iron gates opened on their own, and Peter walked out freely. This moment reveals that angelic assistance is not limited to the Old Testament but continues in the lives of those who trust in God. Angels move at the command of God, executing His will and ensuring that His people fulfill their purpose without being hindered by the plans of the enemy. Angels also played a significant role in the life of Jesus. When He fasted in the wilderness and was tempted by Satan, angels came and ministered to Him. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as He prayed in deep agony, an angel appeared to strengthen Him. These moments show that God's protection does not always remove trials, but it provides strength to endure them. Jesus knew that at any moment He could have called on legions of angels to rescue Him, yet He submitted to the Father's will, knowing that divine assistance was always near. Elisha and his servant experienced a powerful display of angelic protection when they were surrounded by an enemy army. The servant panicked, seeing only the physical threat before them, but Elisha prayed for his eyes to be opened. In that moment, the servant saw that the mountains were filled with horses and chariots of fire, God's angelic army surrounding them. What seemed like an impossible situation was already under divine control. This shows that fear often arises from a lack of spiritual vision, but when believers recognize that God has already sent His help, confidence replaces fear. Angelic protection is not something to be worshipped or relied upon apart from God, but it is a part of His divine plan for His people's safety. Angels move according to His commands, carrying out His purposes with precision and authority. They are not bound by human limitations, nor are they restricted by earthly circumstances. Whether preventing harm, delivering messages, or waging war against unseen forces, angels serve as instruments of God's protective power. Believers can rest in the assurance that they are never alone, that even in the most dangerous moments, God's heavenly hosts are surrounding them. Obedience to God is a vital key to remaining under His divine protection. Throughout Scripture, God consistently calls His people to walk in His ways, follow His commandments, and trust in His guidance. His protection is not a passive force that operates without relationship, it is deeply connected to a life of obedience. When believers align their hearts and actions with God's will, they position themselves under His covering, ensuring that they are led away from danger and into His safety. The story of Noah is a powerful example of how obedience leads to protection. In a world filled with corruption and wickedness, Noah was found righteous because he obeyed God. When the Lord instructed him to build the ark, Noah did not question, delay, or try to modify God's instructions. He followed them precisely, even when it seemed unreasonable. As a result, while the rest of the world perished in the flood, Noah and his family were saved. His obedience did not just protect him, it extended to those connected to him, showing that when one person walks in obedience, it can have generational blessings. Lot's story also demonstrates the connection between obedience and divine protection. When God sent angels to warn him about the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot was hesitant. The angels urged him to leave quickly, but he lingered, reluctant to let go of his past. Yet, because of God's mercy, the angels physically took hold of him and his family and led them out of danger. However, his wife disobeyed God's command by looking back, and as a result, she faced destruction. This moment serves as a sobering reminder that partial obedience is still disobedience. To remain under God's protection, one must follow his instructions completely, without hesitation or compromise. The Israelites experienced both the blessings of obedience and the consequences of disobedience throughout their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. When they obeyed God's commands, He fought for them, provided for them, and led them safely. He parted the Red Sea, sent manna from heaven, and guided them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. However, when they disobeyed, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, facing hardships that could have been avoided. This shows that God's protection is closely linked to obedience. When they followed His voice, they walked in victory, but when they rebelled, they exposed themselves to unnecessary struggles. Jesus Himself emphasized the importance of obedience. He said that those who hear His words and put them into practice are like a wise man who built his house on the rock. When storms came, the house remained standing because it had a strong foundation. But those who hear and do not obey are like a foolish man who built on sand. When the storm hit, destruction followed. Obedience establishes a foundation that withstands the trials of life. It ensures that even when difficulties arise, a person remains secure because they are firmly rooted in God's will. The enemy seeks to lure people away from obedience because he knows that disobedience removes God's covering. He deceived Adam and Eve in the garden by making them question God's instructions. Their disobedience led to separation from God and exposed them to suffering that was never intended for them. The enemy still operates in the same way today, trying to convince believers that obedience is restrictive, unnecessary, or outdated. But those who walk in obedience experience the peace, security, and provision that come from being in alignment with God. Walking in obedience does not mean a life free from challenges, but it ensures that even in difficulties, God is working all things for good.